Hello, sorry for being late.
Okay,
I'm there.
Fine. Well,
sorry, I'm so sorry for being late. The internet there was a problem in my internet.
You're fine. So we'll give it a minute, then I'll begin.
Okay, is my picture clear and everything is okay? Voice and everything?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Just I'll check something. Can you see me right now?
Yes, Abdulghani, you're fine. And well, not now. You turn your camera off.
Yeah, okay. Just I was checking only. 1 minute, please. Okay.
Okay, you're fine now.
Okay.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and begin. And as people joining us, they will be let in. Thank you very much for joining us today for this important event to discuss the policy of citizenship revocation as a reprisal or punishment that the Bahraini government has used to punish dissent, to punish freedom of expression, to punish opposition figures and activists. I remember very well back in November of 2012, it was the eve of the election in the US where former President Barack Obama was running for re-election against the Republican candidate at that time, who was currently Senator Mitt Romney. And while the US, where US citizens were casting their vote, at that time I had a BlackBerry, and I remember receiving pop-in messages and emails of wave of citizenship revocation were announced by the Bahraini Minister of Interior, where the claim was these individuals, and there were around 31, 32 individuals that have violated the national security of the country, worked to destabilize Bahrain. They're no longer Bahrain. I did not go honestly through the list because I got a phone call from a media outlet to do an interview. As they were actually going through the list of names, I learned that I was one of those 31 or 32 individual from the interviewer who was interviewing me. Of course, I'm not going to say I was shocked because nothing shocks me when it comes to the policies of the Al Khalifa regime in Bahrain, but it felt really unfair to me personally, where my ancestor, my grandfather, my great-grandfather knew no land but Bahrain. And all of a sudden, because of my human rights activities, because of my dissent and opposition to this government, the government felt that it's okay for them to revoke my citizenship and basically make me one day non-Bahraini. Now, fortunately, in my situation, I had another citizenship. I'm a naturalized US citizen. So that at least did not give me the negative impact. Now, I'm not downgrading this. Still, it's a right I had, my family had, my children, to be Bahraini like their father. But anyway, but on a bigger scale, not just my case, there were other individuals who their citizenship were revoked. They were not lucky. They did not have a second citizenship waiting for them, or they did not have the luxury to have some other formal documentation identifying them. Now, just imagine these individuals. The number from 32 reached almost to 1,000 individuals, hundreds of people. Don't quote me on the number, but we're talking about large scale of citizen who all of a sudden woke up one day and seen that their citizenship have been revoked. In this seminar or in this event on Bahrain, we are going to discuss the policy, the implication, and we're lucky to have also a Bahraini who was affected by this policy as well. So I'm going to introduce the panelists to you. We have 4 excellent panelists. They are not going to speak in the order I'm going to represent them. So we have Dr. Courtney Raj, PhD, is Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. She served as a chief spokesperson on global press freedom issues for the organization, and oversees CPJ's engagement with the United Nations, the International Governance Forum, and other multilateral institutions, as well as CPJ's campaign on behalf of journalists killed and imprisoned for their work. As veteran journalist, researcher, and free expression advocate, she frequently writes and speaks about intersection of media, technology, and human rights. Her book, Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt, was published in 2016. Prior to joining CPJ, Dr. Raj worked for UNESCO, edited the flagship publication World Trend in Freedom of Expression and Media Development, and managed the Global Freedom of Expression campaign at Freedom House. She has worked as journalist in the United States and Middle East with Al Arabiya, the Daily Star, and the New York Times. Dr. Raj holds a PhD in International Relations from American University. She speaks Arabic, French, and Spanish. We also are fortunate to have one of the leading experts on statelessness issues, Zahra Albarazi, independent consultant on statelessness. She specializes on the nexus between statelessness and forced displacement, and the interlink between discrimination and statelessness, including work on gender inequality in nationality law. Geographically, her work has focused mainly on statelessness and nationality in the Middle East and Africa region. Zahra has been working on issues of statelessness since 2010 and has been involved in conducting studies on statelessness for UNHCR, WRC, IRC, NRC, and the Open Society Justice Initiative and ML House of Human Rights. She holds an LLM in international law from Leeds University. She's also coordinating with a new network called Hawiyati that basically is developing advocacy on a statelessness issue. Hopefully she can tell us a little bit more about this new group. And we also have Ms. Mouna Ben Garga, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, is the innovative lead at Civicus. She currently civil society organization, technologists, social entrepreneurs, and private. Sorry for that. She works on shifting the narrative around human rights and MENA through developing human rights centered innovation. In the MENA, Mouna developed and led over 30 campaigns to increase citizen engagement in the MENA, including Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan. She works to develop on strengthen the role of the MENA activists in exile. She is board member of Humana for Human Rights and Civic Engagement. Mouna has a master in public policy from George Mason University and has written several articles about Arab media, women leadership, and importance of centering intersectional feminist leaders in civil society and human rights in MENA region. Last but not least, we have Mr. Abdulghani Khanjar, who will be speaking to us first. I know Abdulghani personally. I know Abdulghani since I actually been active in politics in the field of human rights. He is a Bahraini citizen whose citizenship was revoked because of his activism. Abdulghani led several initiatives in Bahrain and founded several organizations, whether it's anti-torture or anti-arbitrary detention. Abdulghani also was one of those leaders who worked on a mass petition where over 100,000 Bahraini citizens signed demanding self-determination and representative government that was presented to the United Nations. Abdulghani has appeared in front of the UK Parliament where he presented briefing and information on human rights situation in Bahrain. He also appeared in international publication where he discussed the situation of statelessness and human rights condition in the country. Abdulghani attended Human Rights Council session on numerous times, where I remember him and his colleague Abdulhadi Al-Khawaja and Nabil Rajab and Mr. Hassan Mushema presented several shadow reports to different human rights, United Nations Human Rights Committee body. I think I have spoken more than enough. I'm a moderator, so it looks like I'm the speaker. So without any further ado, Mr. Al-Khanjar, if you please take the floor.
Hi, Hussein, how are you? Sorry, I don't know what to say. Greeting, shall I say good morning or good afternoon or good evening? Because the participants in this valuable seminar are from different countries and different regions. There is different times between here in Tehran and there in UK and in Washington, DC, and so on. So, hello, everybody. It is my pleasure to participate in this valuable seminar about revocation of nationality, specified or specifically speaking about Bahrain. Actually, I prepared a paper with the outlines in this seminar or debate. There is an introduction, then about a little bit about myself and my story as an activist and as a torture victim. After the main topic, revoking nationality or citizenship in Bahrain, a tool of punishment and a brutal tool of punishment used by the government in Bahrain, and the end title is the conclusion or recommendations. Hussein spoke about me quite enough, so I'll just give a little brief within 1 minute about myself. Actually, I was working with Bahrain Human Rights Center with Abdulhadi and Nabil Rajab, and I participated in Geneva, and as well as I participated in the House of Lords for several times. In short, I was arrested in 2010. I endured torture for decades, from 90s until 2000, but my last arrest was in August 2010, along with Abdul Jalil Al-Singais and some prominent activists from Bahrain. We have been tortured for more than 6 months, torture and degrading treatment. We practice over there in the Al Khalifa's jails. And fortunately, I was released along with Abdul Jalil Al-Singais and others in February 2011. I went in hiding after 20 days of releasing me because my house was raided by the army and Saudi troops. So I went in hiding for 2 years in Bahrain. I have been sentenced in absentia for 30 years. And I finally, after 2 years, I escaped from Bahrain to the closest safe area, which is Iran, Tehran. Actually, during that 2 years, I was participating via internet by giving an interview to Bloomberg, to Der Spiegel newspaper, and Channel 4, British Channel 4, Al Jazeera, and other. I was hiding but speaking up. First of all, let me speak about revocation of nationality. First of all, let me mention something very strange. There is an irony when the indigenous people like us lost our citizenship due to the repressive attitude of Al Khalifa's regime, while widely Bahraini citizenship is given to those or to thousands of individuals brought illegally from abroad. This is quite strange. You cannot find this in any place in the world except Bahrain. what the regime is using this tool, I mean revocation of nationality, it has been used as a tool to terrorize activists and their families, to denying them from their political and civil rights. Just imagine, I spoke with one of my friend who was who was revoked from citizenship, and sent to exile, while his family stayed in Bahrain for more than 5 years, because they were not able to travel because they have got a newborn child with no passport. He was suffering. He was just speaking with them. He wanted just to touch, to hug his newborn baby, but he couldn't do that because his newborn baby denied of having passport. Other things that the regime, the Bahraini regime, is using revocation of nationality as a collective punishment. Means the regime or Al Khalifa regime want to punish all those people of Bahrain who stands in Beryl roundabout in 2011. So the regime used this tool as a weapon against those activists and their families. This is first. Secondly, the regime used it to terrorize the Shia in Bahrain. Means he used it as a sectarian tool and trying to terrorize all those who have got any different or have not been, for example, have not been satisfied with his attitude and speaking about corruption, calling for their rights, calling for democracy, calling for the promoting of human rights. This is the story of Bahrainis. We are in Bahrain, we were in Bahrain, and our people in Bahrain are now in a very big jail. And Al Khalifa think that nationality or citizenship is a privilege. They can give it to those who brought from abroad illegally, and they can strip it from the indigenous people of Bahrain. For example, they have now revoked more than 1,000 nationalities, and now within some months there are only because they reinstate for some of the activists. So there are only now 430, I think so, if I'm not wrong, 430 from those activists or those who in jail are without nationality. The regime used this colonial technique to terrorize people of Bahrain, to terrorize the opposition, and to stop or prevent our people from getting their rights. Now, they use the tool in the court, means they arrested the activist, they tortured him, they sent him to injustice and very unfair trial, and from or via that trial or that court, they provoke his nationality to what? to let his children live in Bahrain without passport, without civil rights. They cannot travel, they cannot get work, or they cannot get complete their studies. Even the activist, if he get or released from prison without a nationality, he cannot get any civil rights, he cannot get a job, he cannot complete his study in university, he cannot rent a house, he cannot use or act freely with his properties. Properties means they will take his car, he cannot register his car, he cannot steal or register his house. Everything will be not registered under his name. I think we, or at the end, if I don't know what the time is now. Still, I have got time, Hussein.
You can conclude. You have a minute and a half.
Yeah, we recommend that. Why do this regime used citizenship or revoking nationality as a weapon? Because his closest allies are giving him the green light to complete or continue the violations. If those allies like United States and United Kingdom do not give the regime the green light to use all these crackdown and brutal violation, the regime won't be able to do all this. So I recommend that the regime must reinstate all those revoked nationalities to all the activists. As well, we recommend that the US administration must think about its attitude against the Bahraini people. The US administration now, after Trump, must rethink or use another technique to put a real pressure on the regime to change his brutal attitude against the Bahraini people. Thank you very much, Hussein. I hope I cover all the topic.
Thank you, and I'm sure there'll be time for question and answer, and certainly you'll be able to highlight more. So Zahra, Abdulghani said it's a measure of reprisal. It's a lesson to be taught to some, so the other will pay attention and stop being activists or have the courage to dissent. What does the international law says about it? What does the different studies that you've done and the work you have carried out says about this policy, and where does this stand when it comes to Western government who claim to be democratic, claim to be inclusive? So Zahra, if you could please start with your presentation.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. It is very much a privilege for me to be able to speak among you, and also humbling to speak after you, Hussein, and after Abdulghani. What I want to do a little bit and very briefly is to zone in on the issue of statelessness specifically. And as your question indicates, really how the government is using citizenship as a political tool. So rather than just a citizenship being used completely and being manipulated as a political tool. It isn't just in the case of Bahrain, historically the cases of states across the world to see citizenship more as a political tool than anything else. Political tool of who to keep in and who to exclude from a nation state. Like you said, like you mentioned at the beginning, Hussein, on November 2012, so 8 years ago this month, just a few days ago, we were all shocked, anyone interested in the issue of Bahrain or working on the issue of citizenship, to see the first the first lot of people being stripped of their citizenship. And what is worrying and what is very sad is that we're all a little bit worried every time we go back to look at the number, because we know the number is continuing to increase. It is a tool that they've continued to use, and they haven't there's been no shame to back down from this policy. I remember as well that when it first happened, it didn't happen discreetly. It was aired everywhere in Bahrain. Everyone was talking about it, from the authorities, from state authorities. It was an issue that was being very much disseminated as this is, what are we doing? This is good. So there's no element of discretion from the state. They wanted people to know this doing. It wasn't no one was trying to do it sort of under the rug or secretly or discreetly. It's like, this is a policy that we have, we want to announce it. And there were also at the same time attempts by the government to very quickly, when they announced that this is what they wanted to do, there were attempts by the government to say that what they were doing was very much in line with their international obligations. This was a sentence that right from the beginning, even before, not in response to criticism, but right from the beginning, we saw on the news politicians and state representatives saying it's very much in light, I think, in light of maintaining national security and ensuring international agreements are met and not violating our international obligations. They would even quote international obligations that they did have and what international treaties say. However, if we look even briefly a little bit more into the international obligations that Bahrain has, this is definitely completely not the case. To start off with, for a state that is talking about how the revocation of nationality and leaving people stateless, leaving people without any access to any right, to any nationality in the world, is very much part of their international, is under their international obligations. They are not party to the relevant conventions. So we have two conventions on statelessness, the 1954 convention and the 1961 convention, and there has been absolutely no attempt or any step by the authority to try and become a party to these conventions. They're very relevant conventions in response to what they're doing. But even if we look further from the very specific statelessness conventions that kind of most countries in the world are a part of, like the Convention of the Right of the Child, like the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, that Bahrain is very much a party to, as many other countries in the world. Pretty much every convention in the world has something to do with the right to nationality for everybody in that convention. And there are very, 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 very strict conditions under which someone can have their nationality taken off them, especially if that will leave them stateless, which is the reality for the majority of people who have been stripped of their nationality in Bahrain. And if we put the reasons given by the Bahraini government, which have often been very vague, reasons such as damage to the security of the state, which is what the nationality law ascribes to, and in most cases where nobody's been charged of anything, and the majority of cases there haven't been no charges that can provide evidence that there has been any kind of threats to the security of the state or damage to the security of the state. That simply means that this their international obligations. Everybody has a right to nationality. You can't just take someone's nationality off them because that suits your agenda. So those are kind of in general what we're seeing in Bahrain, using it as a political tool. It is a very easy method to silence opposition. If you are trying to target a group of people and delegitimize their voice, then make them non-nationals, because non-nationals have less of a voice to speak about a country than nationals do. So an attempt to delegitimize people's voices is by taking their nationality off them. You're not actually part of this community anymore. That's what they're trying to say. You're not actually part of our body of citizens, and therefore who gives you the right to speak about what's happening in our country? At the same time, it silences opposition. People I know who have been happy to speak out in the past, even if there are threats of some jail time, even if there are threats to their family, stopped when the threat became revocation of nationality, because they knew the consequences of that. Being left stateless would mean being left completely without any rights, being left irregular in any country they went to. So it's a method of delegitimizing a voice and also silencing opposition at the same time. And also goes along with certain demographic agendas that countries may have, if to try and prove and to try and show their citizens, which is why they were so vocal about the policies to begin with, that what we're doing is because there are people that we believe belong, and there are people that we believe don't belong. And that is not for a state to decide. That is for law to decide. That is for a nationality law that respects its international obligations to decide. It can't be that whatever ruling state at whatever point can decide who does and who doesn't belong. We do see this around the world, unfortunately. It's not just in Bahrain. We see groups of people being denationalized en masse. If we look at the history of the Kurds, for example, in Syria, and the Kurds of Iraq, a big group of them were denationalized en masse. And we also do see states denationalizing individuals to try and delegitimize their voice. We see that, for example, in Turkey, and we see it across the Middle East and also North Africa. So unfortunately, this isn't kind of a unique case in the region. There's also an element of punishment towards it as well. What we've seen, what I've just of a very quick note, because I know time is running out. What is positive coming from this kind of very worrying and depressing situation is the unification and the solidarity that I have seen from people who've been affected by this and from advocates working on this issue. So we've seen a lot of campaigning on this issue. We've seen a lot of international work on this issue. We've seen protests bravely continuing, people who are bravely continuing to speak out, as Abdulghani says, even in hiding, people are speaking out, people like himself. But clearly there's not enough being done because the numbers are increasing, and there seems to be no attempt at kind of in-country saying that this is not what's happening. Very quickly, as well as the right to nationality being deprived, being a violation of international rights, so is everything that comes with that. So you are no longer a citizen of Bahrain, living in Bahrain, or being abroad or whatever. That means you're not able to access a whole host of different rights, which is also other violations that the country is committing. Whether that's rights to access certain employments or free healthcare or education. And further than that, because alongside the revocation of nationality, Bahrain also does have many other issues of statelessness that it isn't resolving. For example, women aren't allowed to give their nationality to their children in the country. There is a big stateless group of Baduns. There's a stateless group of Ajams. So statelessness is already having all sorts of different dynamics, which adds to the problem of those who've been revoked nationality. For example, as we hear a lot, when babies are born to Bahraini men who've been deprived of their nationality, the mother can't give her nationality to her child. This means that the statelessness has become intergenerational. The children of these men are also being born stateless, and they're living a life of statelessness as well. And obviously, every child has a right to a nationality, and having children born in your territory, they're stateless because of revocation of nationality, is a complete and utter violation of a basic human right. I'm going to stop there because I think I ran out of time. Husain, very quickly, because Husain asked about Hawiyati. If anybody is interested, you could find us online on our Twitter and get involved. It is a very new statelessness network across the Middle East and North Africa, where we're trying to get actors working on and interested in the issue of statelessness from across the region to kind of come together in solidarity and help each other work and address these issues. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Zahra, very much. I think, Zahra, you ended it at an excellent point when you talked about campaign, when you talked about the effort by the government, or the goal was to basically do a policy of comprehensive silence, of comprehensive fear. But then you've seen the solidarity and campaigns.
Yeah,
So here
absolutely.
comes Mouna with Civicus, who are experts when it comes to campaigns. And of course, Mouna herself led numerous campaigns. So Mouna, when it comes to civil society and this policy of citizenship revocation, where, give us the basically, how does it look for the civil society when its members, the right of nationality is challenged and basically violated?
Thank you so much, Husain and Zahra and Dr. Khanjar for being part of this panel. And also, like, while you were thinking, I was like, where is civil society and human rights on this? So I will be the person who will have the PowerPoint presentation, but it's just to give you really a visual about how bad it is in certain areas. And actually, as Zahra zoomed in about the issue of, people without citizenship or, nationality, I wanted to give you how it is all this related to the democratic process, to citizen participation, to democracy as a whole that, many in our region, in the MENA region, they don't really, see it as important, and why it is a threat for everyone. So here, the campaign aspect and changing the narrative around these abuses. I put like the first quote from the Article 15 of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, that everyone has the right to a nationality. So it is your right. It's not a privilege. It's not, nobody should take it from you, as you did not decide to be born in that country. You did not decide to be born to a certain family, to carry on a certain, last name. So it is, by birth, by your right as a human being to have, to reserve your nationality and your citizenship. Unfortunately, this issue of revoking citizenship, it's one among many tactics that states and other actors are using it to repress civic space. And the Bahrain case, on the kind of, as I said, zooming out and seeing how the world is acting, people now live in mostly enclosed spaces or repressed spaces. Like only 3% of the world population lives in countries with open civic space. And when we say civic space, and I know this, this is used a lot across activist, human rights, and international organization, for the normal citizen really does not, sounds bad. Like, open, what does it mean civic space? And what the issue if we are, most of the world is living in closed and repressed and obstructed civic space. Civic space is your right as a citizen and your right as a person living in a land, in a state, to participate in policies, to have health, to have services, to hold your government accountable, to hold the people that you are electing or the one who's ruling to their words. It is more than just an issue for activists and human rights defenders or NGOs or civil society. So Bahrain is, as Zahra, for example, stated, it is one example of the red map of the civic space in the MENA region, unfortunately. It is not different from its neighbors countries. And for sure, the Middle East and North Africa is among the most closed spaces in the world. And for multiple reasons, the type of, type of governments, authoritarian governments and totalitarian governments across the region, coup d'etats across the region as well. And we see sometimes the hope in Tunisia and some reforms that is happening in Jordan or in Morocco, but still we are living in the region that is closed, and Bahrain is not going that far from this trend of closing civic space and the issue of citizen and the issue of civil society. So where the violations are happening and why it is important. So the issue of revoking citizenship, it is actually goes in line with the 10 top violation that we are seeing in the civic freedom. And one of them is the criminal defamation. One of them is the harassment and the intimidation of civil society actors and human rights defenders. And these intimidation tactics are the most extreme one, especially in the case of citizenship revocation, because it's kind of the states or the government look at it as a way to end any other opposition or ends any other request for accountability, for transparency, for the participation of citizens. So the danger of that for civil society, it doesn't only silence the civil society or silence the couple of activists, because as you know, in many countries in our region, you cannot even create, organizations. And most of the organizations are either they being labeled as, terrorist groups, or they being, limited by restrictive laws. So they cannot even register or become like having their own identity, or, the rights of people to organize and to protest or to group, to a certain cause. So, this issue of revoking, it becomes one tactics used, and it is true. Bahrain is not the first country that been using this. It's been also in more democratic countries such as the UK and others, as a way to put national security in the heart of citizenship. And I did not want to use other. I think Zahra covered some of the examples, but for example, more than 600,000 people in Myanmar, they've been stateless because of their ethnic groups or because of their religion. And the big issue is citizenship is a democratic ideal that must be safeguarded. So it's not a privilege that your state is giving you. It is your right and should be there in exercising your right and other rights that you have, your right to health, your right to access to education, your right, to have a good living. So it is part of, or it is the first right as a human to be part of your state, and not having that taken away because of your affiliations or because of your opposition to a certain regime or a certain countries. The other, challenge that we are seeing is that is this distance between normal citizens or citizens that are not active as activists or human rights defenders, and between the human rights defenders that through these type of system that are labeled as second-class citizens. The issue here is that moving from one class to another, if we cannot put it this way, it's not difficult, because between you have a legal system that being tailored and played with to fit the government narrative, and here are the cases of Bahrain. So everyone who think they are secured against this, that this doesn't touch them, that's not the reality, because between having someone's citizenship taken away because you label them, and 1,000 person, it's not a small number for a population of 1.5 million. That's not small number, and we know it will in the future because it becomes like a tactic to do that. So looking at, and in some cases, or the big also another challenge, that in the international law, they give the state, the possibility, or they give the state, the legal aspect to judge on the nationality. So there is a big gap between the international human rights aspect and how the national level, and there is no mechanism really to find, to solve this gap between how the international human rights aspect is being looked at and how it's being applied at the national level, and how we keep those government accountable to it. So at the end, I think citizenship revocation expansion is growing. I know we had this, as I said, since 2000, since 9/11, it became like used, under national security in many cases. But as a recommendation, or how and what we need to do, campaigning at the regional level and the national level is key. I think the other aspect is our diaspora, the Middle East and North African diaspora, and our activists in exile has to play a more role in lobbying and advocacy. Unfortunately, and that these states, including Bahrain and others and in the region, they've been putting more money day after day to lobby against the human rights and activists and opposition in the US, in the UK, in the European Union. So they are everywhere. But also the number of the diaspora in exile from our region also is increasing. And I think we have a power of campaigning outside our borders. And I mean our borders in terms like of our countries in the Middle East. And here the power, when you have closed spaces where you cannot act in your own country, what and where you can act. And I think the international pressure, it's one. In other terms, there is a really big gap in the research level. And it took like a while, for me and my former colleague to really assess how citizen revocation really, related to the closing of civic space, especially in the gap between the national laws and between the international level. So, for the people here who are involved at the UN level, who are involved at the international level, I think to be more explicit about how we can bridge the gap about what states can do and cannot do under the human rights, declarations, and how we can really also bridge the gap about what it can, it is under the human rights or fundamental human rights that cannot be abused. So these are the two recommendations, and I'm happy to have any questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mouna, for your presentation. I think we probably will have several questions to the panelists, but before, of course, that we have Dr. Raj. Doctor, if I look at one underlining issue that is shared among all those activists or opposition figures, like, for example, Mr. Abdulghani Khanjar and his colleagues, the freedom of expression issue, the freedom of speech issue, because they spoke against the human rights violations. Because Abdulghani said, we ought to have a representative government, a representative democracy. Why the ruling elite, or why the rule only in the hand of one family? And the result was his citizenship was revoked. So the effect of citizenship revocation on freedom of expression, not only in Bahrain, if you give us how this affected journalism. We know, for example, the only semi-independent newspaper, Al-Wasat in Bahrain, was closed. Several bloggers like Dr. Abdul Singais was arrested, sentenced to life in prison because of their journalistic or freedom of expression activities, which the government considers to be against the law in Bahrain. So with that, I would like to hear your view on the current situation in Bahrain and the region.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I have always wanted to go to Bahrain, actually, since I think back in 2010 or 2011 when I first tried, when I used to work at Freedom House, and have never been able to get in. We were actually denied entries. So as you all know, best of all, as Bahrainis, it is a very challenging country to work in. If you are a journalist, if you are a reformer, or any sort of human rights defender. And so I just want to thank you for inviting me here and recognizing that despite my deep interest and love in Bahrain, I'm not an expert on Bahrain, but what I am an expert on is the right to freedom of expression and what it means when you deny that right. So it is very clear that revoking a citizen's nationality for exercising their right to freedom of speech or to press freedom amounts to a violation of human rights as guaranteed under international law. Unfortunately, some nationality laws explicitly allow for the deprivation of nationality for a show of disloyalty by an act or speech, or because of purported support for terrorism, which we know in Bahrain, as well as in many other places in the Middle East and beyond. Support for terrorism is often a fig leaf for calls for reform or support for an opposition party, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or Shia parties in Sunni-dominant countries in the Middle East. It's clear that states must avoid applying such provisions in this manner because they would infringe, of course, on other human rights norms and standards. And I think that we've heard, very well from others here about how vital the realization of other human rights are and contingent upon the right to nationality. And so if you revoke that nationality, it has serious consequences for their ability to exercise their other human rights. And of course, it has an incredibly chilling effect on anyone else who would speak their mind or write about what is happening in the country. So I think what we're seeing is, this demographic engineering project that's going on in Bahrain, certainly since the 2011 uprisings and the so-called Arab Spring, has been implemented in retaliation for journalism, for blogging. And, we've seen that Bahrain's Sunni-led government has tried dozens of activists in the Shiite majority island. And according to the Committee to Protect Journalists' last prison census, which granted was at the end of last year, there were at least 6 journalists imprisoned for their work in Bahrain. But we are in the process of finalizing this year's census. So it's, likely that number could change. But the core point is that there are numerous journalists and bloggers, and we don't distinguish between the two when they are doing acts of journalism, who are imprisoned, and they are being, in some cases, denied adequate medical treatment. And I think it's really important for us to realize that, obviously, as I mentioned at the outset, this has been an ongoing problem for many years. This year is different. We are in the midst of a pandemic. So not only has Bahrain jailed journalists and in some cases then revoked their citizenship, but they're keeping them in prison in conditions where they cannot practice social distancing. They can't practice the hygiene they need. And we've seen, for example, Ahmed Humaidan, who has suffered persistent eye infections due to inadequate hygiene. The case of Abdulghani Khanjar, who you mentioned before, has been repeatedly denied access to adequate medical care. So again, this issue of stripping citizenship, the verdicts in some of these cases have been upheld in stripping these journalists and political prisoners of their citizenship. Many times this is, as I said, linked to terrorism or terrorism-related offenses. And I think that we want to be very concerned about, for example, in Jaziri's case, for example, where he is facing conditions that are very concerning and actually managed to report on them from inside prison, a firsthand account that came after the government tried to whitewash the situation through its official kind of human rights organization. And Jaziri actually disputed the claims from the government about, and showed that it was overcrowded and there had not been any attempts to establish measures to prevent COVID-19. So, these issues are interlinked because under international law, you have the right under Article 19, of course, of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the UN Declaration on Human Rights to freedom of expression. And there is also a right, of course, under Article 15 in the UDHR and Article 12 of the ICCPR to the right to nationality, and that no one should be arbitrarily deprived of this right. And there is simply no way to think that somebody who is expressing themselves either by reporting on facts on the ground, even if that happens to be about a protest or about unsafe prison conditions, or whether they are expressing their opinions and commentary, as is again common with many journalists and bloggers, that the revocation of nationality is in any way proportionate or a legitimate or serves any sort of legitimate aim. It may serve an aim, which is to silence them and to create a chilling effect, but that is not a legitimate aim. And of course, Bachelet, the human rights head, has underscored this point under international law. So unfortunately, Bahrain is really, as has been described here, at the forefront of using citizenship revocation as a tool of political repression and restrictions on freedom of expression and press freedom. Unfortunately, we also see that other countries in the region, including Kuwait and Syria, but also around the world, Azerbaijan, Belarus, India, all countries where we have seen the use of citizenship revocation being used in retaliation for journalism that the authorities would rather not see take place. There's another issue, which is, even in relatively strong countries like democracies like Canada and the UK, there are laws that allow authorities to strip dual nationals of nationality if they're convicted of terrorism or terrorism-related crimes. So, we see, again, another example of where, in some cases, kind of frameworks that are developed in strong democracies with rule of law, with checks and balances, with an independent judiciary, are then interpreted and reapplied in contexts that lack an independent judiciary, that lack an independent press. You mentioned, the closure of Al Wasat, one of the few independent outlets that, or semi-independent outlets that had been left in Bahrain. But they lack any of the safeguards. So, I can only imagine, or I don't even know that I can imagine what it must be like to lose your right to be in your country, for your children to lose their right to be in their country. We know that there are several Bahraini journalists and activists in exile around the world, and that in and of itself is its own challenge, because many countries have made it very difficult to get exile. We are working with countries to improve the ability to provide journalists who are under threat with access to those countries. But then, if you lose your citizenship, not being able to go back to your country and for your children to go back to your country is something that I think, anyone listening to this call should just really consider what that means for a moment. I mean, we can talk about international law and norms, which frankly are, we're trying to create norms, but I think the fact is that we're seeing a lot of challenge to international law, to how we actually enforce that and the normative power of international law. And so I think it is also up to us to feel as people, as individuals, what that is like, and that is absolutely not an acceptable approach as a response to journalism, to commentary, and to free expression. So let me leave it there, and thank you again for the opportunity to address this group.
Well, thank you, Dr. Raj, and thank you for our panelists for their excellent presentation. I see that we are now getting thrown with lots of questions, and the reason I wanted to leave it this way, I want the questions to be tight because I knew there'll be lots of interest, and I want to be fair to as many as possible. So there are some questions here directed towards specific panelists, and there are some questions directed to everyone on the panel. So let me read some of them, and please, as panelists, feel free to answer as you go. So I'll read a group of questions, and then I'll open it for the panelists as they wish, and then we'll read the rest. So from Dr. Jalal Fayrouz, who's also a former MP and a leading Bahraini leader in the pro-democracy movement, he's asking By the way, let me just say the questions are typed, not verbal. So please type your questions because I see a hand risen. So Dr. Jalal Fayrouz is asking about what are the possibility that we have some kind of legislation on the international level, and if there is such possibility, how can then that be implemented or forced through European Parliament or other institution? And then there are some questions to Mr. Khanjar asking about what kind of role the United Nations played, whether it's in your case or the case of your colleagues who lost their citizenship. Then Zahra, you have a couple of questions about the right of the mother in Bahrain to pass the nationality. Also, what does it mean for a youth Bahraini raising up in a country where he does not have the nationality of that country? Of course, the question is much more detailed. Please feel free to go through it as you answer. We also have a question for the panel on how could we advocate in the West against the citizenship revocation policy while we have our own Western democracies revoking the citizenship of its own people. If you remember, Dr. Courtney, the case of the Yemeni American who was not allowed by Secretary of State Pompeo to be issued a passport so she can come back to a country that she was born in. Now, quote unquote, I'm not certain she was born or naturalized, but at the end of the day, she is a US citizen. And of course, we have several cases in UK of citizenship revocation. With that, I want to open up the panelists. Please feel free to read these questions and answer them. I would like to start like the way we began. So Mr. Khanjar, if you could please respond to some of these questions. The floor is yours. Abdulghani, if you unmute, please. You're muted.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hussein. Thank you to everybody. I think that United Nations were not able to do anything to stop the violation in Bahrain. It is unfortunately that the Council, the Human Rights Council, not able to do much, even though international human rights group are doing well. They raised violations. They made a lot of campaigns against the violations of the regime in Bahrain, but unfortunately, there is no tools to put in a clear pressure on Bahraini regime to stop its violations. But we have to continue our work. The international human rights group must stand with the Bahraini people. They have to send letters and for example, manage some activities against the violations happened in Bahrain. The people of Bahrain is screaming. The regime is brutally tortured people of Bahrain. Regime has used many kind of tools and violations against the people of Bahrain. I think the US administration must stop supporting and protecting such a regime like that in Bahrain. When Mr. Pompeo spoke about, some days ago, spoke about those dictatorships in the world, he forgot to mention his close ally in Bahrain and what is happening in Bahrain. Is this a hypocrisy when the administration, US administration is speaking about certain countries in the region and forgot to mention what is happening in the Gulf states and do not want to speak to their allies to stop their violations like what is happening in Bahrain? Yes, Hussein.
Thank you. I know Dr. Raj has to leave us soon, so I would like her to intervene if possible and answer some of the questions that directly were directed towards her.
Thanks so much. Yeah, let me just address that issue. I think that what somebody raised about like how can countries like the US or UK or other, strong Western democracies promote this when they're kind of backhanding doing it on their own. I mean, I think this is exactly the problem with these types of laws. And, just to add to that, the so-called Muslim travel ban, which was of course adapted to look like it was not a Muslim travel ban, but like personal opinion. Anyhow, the point is like when you add those types of things and when you see governments like the United States or others where they revoke citizenship of naturalized citizens, that has a profoundly negative impact on ability to advocate against these types of restrictions on and allowances for the stripping of nationality. It makes it very difficult to do advocacy with those governments because they point to that hypocrisy, and that's why that is not helpful. If I might just speak from a personal place here, being my partner is a dual citizen, a naturalized American citizen, and when policies come up that target specific nationalities or religions or types of people, you don't have confidence that you are going to have the rights that you think that you have as a citizen. And I think that we need to be, we need to take that retaliation, against people by stripping them of citizenship off of the table. Like that is something that is too profound and important, I think, for countries to be playing at. And so, there is really nothing more detrimental than hypocrisy coming from countries, because it diminishes their ability and our ability to do effective advocacy on this issue.
Well, thank you, Courtney. I know you have to run for another meeting, so I want to appreciate your time and thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Zahra, I want to turn to you. There are some specific questions I think you could address, and also the question of Dr. Jalal Fayrouz about what else internationally could be done. Please go ahead.
Yeah. A lot of questions, and apologies if I don't address yours. I quickly picked a few. One of the questions with regards to what kind of international law could be developed to address the ban of revocation of nationality that make people stateless. International law, I think, is very much sufficient on this issue. I don't think we have a problem of the lack of laws. We just have a problem of the lack of implementation. Even if you look at the Bahraini constitution, there are elements of the Bahraini constitution that disallow what is happening, but it's just not respected and it's violated. So I don't think there's necessarily, I don't think our problem is a lack of already existing laws that ban states from discriminating in their nationality laws and processes and policies. With regards to the gender discrimination, what we're seeing is not just people being born stateless inside Bahrain, but those who've also left Bahrain, who are having children outside of the country. So you have Bahrainis who have been left stateless in the UK, for example, who've had children and their children are stateless in the UK. So it's across the world we're seeing Bahrainis who are being born stateless because of this gender discrimination and because also the dynamic of the revocation. Unfortunately, Bahrain is one of the 12 countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and which are the majority of the countries worldwide, that still have this discrimination against women in their nationality law. And what this means for children is many things. Sometimes the basic ability to get a birth certificate to prove that you legally exist and where you were born and who your parents are, which will allow you to, in the future, potentially redress your situation of your legal status is impossible. You can't get a birth certificate. There will be inheritance issues in the future when you are unable to inherit your mother's or your father's or your family's property. And, looking not necessarily on this situation because these children are still young, but looking more internationally, when we find people who were born stateless or lived a life of statelessness, there are so many different psychological impacts that can have on an individual and a family and a community, including that of kind of identity problems. It's an ongoing issue. One of the countries, one of the questions, sorry, does it backfire? I've not seen this type of policy backfire because it may be true. I don't necessarily think it means that people don't have anything to lose. Because when you speak, it may not just be you who are targeted. It could be family members who are targeted. It could be colleagues. It could be associates. It could be anyone else around you. So it's not just you who are in the fire of this. And being stripped of your nationality often can throw you into this crazy situation where you need to try and figure out what to do with your life and what your family life and where you can go and live, despite the fact that you're irregular wherever you go, and where you might be able to seek asylum. And it throws you into this kind of situation where your main focus may not be able to be trying to advocate for basic rights in your country. So I haven't seen it backfire, especially given the fact that it will silence others. What can be done? I mean, that is always the biggest question, and I wish I had an easy answer for that. I mean, there's a lot that, you know, people like Husain are already doing with regards to trying to engage with mechanisms, UPR system, and other mechanisms. There's a lot being engaged with that. I think it's really important to put pressure on other countries to, at minimum, understand more what is happening, so that where we're looking at situations of people applying for asylum or living in other countries, there is more understanding, facilitation of those cases, potentially facilitation of naturalization in different countries. This is not resolving the situation. This is just trying to ease some of the suffering. And also, there have been other suggestions, for example, to clamp down on the individuals who are making these policies, perhaps, for example, imposing bans on them traveling, etc. So those are some of the suggestions that I hear of, but I wish I had a better answer, more than what you and your organizations are already trying to do to campaign on this. Sorry if I spoke too long.
Thank you, Zahra. I think we come back to campaigning, Mouna. Campaigning, especially campaigning by the victims themselves. So if you could address some of these questions as well.
Yeah, and actually that's where I will pick it. Thank you, Husain and Zahra. What we can do. I know sometimes things like look really helpless, like we cannot really do a lot, but actually we can. So there is, we learned that we need to take all the time a hybrid approach, like an approach that combines different tactics and play on the strength of different, actors. So if we categorize, there is a long-term approach that Husain and his organization is doing, other organization is doing, which is the advocacy, keep the issue in the front page, keep, talking about this situation, either at the international level, by having more experts coming and talking and convening, but also there is the strengthening of civil society and the strengthening of activists, either inside the country or in the exile. And again, I really want to emphasize the role of the people outside our countries to do that, either through campaigning. And one of the examples that I think was really efficient was a campaign that was led in Egypt called Unmask Them. And the idea was that you call out the people who are doing these abuses when they leave the country for, meetings, for official, states. So if they are going to Belgium to visit the European Union, commission, there it is your place to make your case in front of it, either through protest, preparing their profile and their abuses. And, in a lot of democratic states, they really want to distance themselves from human rights abusers because of the pressure of their population. So creating alliances within the countries where we know they have a power of foreign policy, such as the US, France, Germany. I know now like Turkey is playing a little bit in our region, so we need also to be really mindful of the geopolitical, pressures that can be happening in the Bahrain or in other, countries in the region. Documenting the people, as I said, that is really hard. And if you even Google it in English or even in Arabic, you find like article that really doesn't link to the human experience of revoking citizenship. And here, like, I think Zahra played a lot on the women, the children. So revoking is not about human rights activists and civil society. Actually, it is about the story of a human who being taken their only right, that did not choose to be born in that country. So taking a storytelling approach, and here where the campaign tactics are really important to really give a sense of the impact of these type of discriminatory policies on the normal human. Like, Dr. Khanjar, what did happen to you? You are an activist, but how can you document and tell your story in a way that link to a normal citizen in the US, in Tunisia, in Morocco, that this is a threat for everyone? As part also of the short term, and I think someone also wrote about the mechanism, we need emergency mechanisms or emergency tactics. So if someone, because you cannot avoid it, apparently, it is out of our reach. What we can do is these things to change, but what we do now. So emergency funds to support the people who will be stateless, that they will be, leaving the Bahrain. That is really important. Advocating either in the international level with international NGOs that have the capacity to support refugees, to support stateless people, or, with the UN and other mechanism that we can take this wave of people that without citizenship and find like other places for them, find other countries in the meantime that we are putting our effort to change things. About the lobbying and the Biden-Harris, and this is also about the campaigning. So I think shaming the human rights abuser from Bahrain when they do official visits to countries that they have a power of foreign policy, it's important. And there is like other way to do it, but I mentioned this example because it really worked with Egypt. And it was really important to create this profile, and you can go, it's in maskthem.com or ikshifuhum. The other tactics is that unfortunately, many of these administrations, their foreign policy is driven a lot by lobbyists. And to be honest, the lobbyist here in the US, Husain knows like where most of the thing is going, is to not support democratic transition in the MENA region. Like, we have powers in the Gulf or from the Gulf advocating against Tunisia, the Libya situation. So the Bahrain, it really aligns with this narrative in Washington, D.C. about not supporting democratic governments, but also not to not give a spotlight on the issue of human rights outside, the NGOs or, like the think tank. So it doesn't really go outside a lot because of the effort of the lobbying. So what I think, and another tactics, is really to strengthen the lobbying. And sometimes as an activist or an international NGO, we really are reserved about saying this like directly, but this is the reality. If you want to shape the foreign policy of the US, you need to lobby. And lobby have different forms: advocacy with alliances here in the US, or direct lobbying for the administration. But for the administrator to just support democracy or to really focus on one issue, it's really less likely. Even though I know but that Biden promised to have the first democracy summit, and he promised to do it in Tunisia, which is where I'm from, to celebrate our 10 years of revolution. So this is also can be a space for us to bring the issue of the Middle East and human rights thing. So there is no one tactics. We need all to come together to really support this. Campaigning is key, digital campaigning, keeping the storytelling of the people who've been revoked, tackling the issue not only from activist perspective, but child, women, rights, lands rights, people, other aspect to that revoking. But most importantly is really to study the impact, because there is not a lot of research about it either in Bahrain or the Middle East, and there is not a lot of documentation around the impact that we need to use as our weapon. So I hope that helps, but there is no one answer, sorry.
Well, look, we are beyond the time that was allocated for this. I knew very well that this will be a very lively debate. It's an issue that touches people personally and also touches international law or international stage. So I want to thank the panelists, of course, Zahra. I want to thank Mouna, Dr. Raj, who's not with us, and of course, Mr. Abdulghani Khanjar, for their time, for their participation, their excellent insight. And I hope, I already can see that something practical hopefully will come out of this. Both Mouna and Zahra leading some initiatives that probably ADHRB and our partner organization can work as a liaison to connect them with that. I agree with Mouna, we certainly need to ratchet up our advocacy / lobbying. I never, ADHRB or I personally never shy from the word lobbying, because we need to do that, and we need to do it more. And let's really take the new administration, whenever that administration, whether there's a peaceful transition of power or eviction from the White House, whenever they actually take their place, let's put them to test and see if their rhetoric really meet their policy. With that, thank you very much, everyone, for attending and participating in this event. It was an honor to host you all, and hopefully we'll see you in some other future.
Thank you so much, Husain. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Husain.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Well done,
Thank you.
well conducted. Thank you, all the speakers.